the front cover, like we said earlier, houses the oil pump assembly. And we talked about the pressure relief valve and so forth. The oil pump, when you buy the oil pump for this motor, it actually just comes with a box with these gears in it. Now this is, like I said, your oil pump drive shaft gear. So we want to install this. This gear here is going to go into that hole right there, and then of course it goes up into the distributor hole, and the distributor drives it. You never want to put this thing in dry, so we're going to take some, I like this moly graphite here. We're going to take moly graphite and we're just going to make sure that that intermediate shaft is lubed up here where the distributor goes. We want some lube in there. So here's the thing that you guys need to remember if you're going to do one of these. Buicks are notorious for not picking up the oil signal or not getting a prime on the oil pump. What happens with this external pump, and I've even seen situations where the technician is changing the oil and they let the motor sit for a day or two and they don't prime the pump, and they go to fire up the engine and they got no oil pressure. So that's kind of a problem on these. One of the things that you have to do is we're going to go ahead and just very carefully slide this in here, and that's going to be our oil pump gear, one of the gears. This is a geared pump, which is very typical of GM. And then you just take the other gear here, right? And there's a dot on the gear, which doesn't mean a whole lot, but I usually put that up. I have that facing up here. This gear's not really timed or anything like that, and you want to put a little bit of lube on that hub there. We don't want anything dry in here. Now the other thing is, and this goes back a long ways. I've been doing, I've had experience with these Buicks for probably 25 years. I haven't done too many of them, but I've worked on a lot of them. The manufacturer and pretty much every Buick engine guru builder I've ever known says that what you need to do to get this to pick up a prime is you take Vaseline. I know that sounds crazy, but you take Vaseline and you're going to fill this housing with it. So that's pretty much standard procedure for this. So you want to pack this Vaseline in. What this does is this allows the oil pump to pick up a prime. The thing is, what happens in some cases with this type of pump is somebody who doesn't really fully understand how critical this is, they'll put this together without putting any Vaseline, in this case, in here, or what they will do is they will let the pump sit for too long of a period of time after they change the oil. And if this pump does not pick up a prime, the problem with that is the engine's going to fire up and you're not going to have any oil pressure. Well, imagine the engine running and you have no oil pressure. The engine's functioning, but there's no oil pressure in the engine. That's what we call a catastrophic failure. Because if you run this engine without oil pressure, even for a really short period of time, it only takes a few seconds, you're going to do internal damage. And if you run it for any length of time at all, you're going to toast the motor. So really, running this way is not an option. So we're gonna this is kind of like packing a wheel bearing here. We want to take and we want to pack this Vaseline in there. And I know it sounds crazy. I 25 years ago, I worked with a guy. He was much older than me at the time, and he's the one who first told me that you need to pack Vaseline into these gears. I thought he was joking. I thought, come on, man. I was born at night, you know, but it wasn't last night. But no, it turns out this is actually the proper way for lubing this. And remember, Vaseline is petroleum based. It's an oil. It's actually manufactured from crude oil. So it dissolves in motor oil. It's even though that's the case, we always like to, after we prime the pump here and do the cam break in, we definitely want to change our oil and filter. So we're going to pack that Vaseline in there good and tight, and you might want to turn the gears a few times, and you want to see it squishing out. If it does, just go ahead and you want to pack it in there really good. Make sure that you get that Vaseline all over in there, just like packing a wheel bearing. It's a lot like that. And again, this Vaseline is not going to hurt this engine. It's not going to clog anything up. It's actually going to allow this pump to pick up the prime, and before we fire this thing up, obviously we're going to prime it. We're going to prime the pump ahead of time and make sure that we establish oil pressure before we ever crank the motor over. So that is how that is supposed to look. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but when you're building a Buick, what you need to do is you need to go buy a bottle of that stuff. Go with the cover. Now remember, we talked about, and I went ahead and painted this black. I didn't really want to do that, but I could not get all of that orange paint out of the crevices and stuff, and it looked terrible, and I didn't want to put that up against this aluminum cover with splotches of orange paint on it. So we matched up our spring, and we came to the conclusion that the white spring in the set matched the old spring, and then we have this cup. So what you do is you also want to put a little bit of lube on this stuff. All right, don't put this in dry. And then we'll put a little bit of lube on the end of our spring here where it goes into the cup. And the cup basically looks like that. And it slides down in to this bore here. Slides down in just like that. And then you have your plug, of course. We cleaned that all up and got it clean, and then there's a gasket. So you want to take your plug, put your new gasket on it like that. Make sure that gasket is on that plug. And then you just take your plug and it goes right over that. And you got to kind of push that spring down. The plug is what puts the tension on that spring when you put it in there. So you want to put that in there. And then there's actually a torque spec for this plug. So we're going to go ahead and torque that. I won't bore you with all that, but once you get that on, make sure you torque it to specs. This plug has a torque on it. Then of course our cover is basically going to go like that. So we'll get the bolts and put that on. And this is not only your pressure relief valve here, but it is also your cover for your oil pump gears, and it's your oil filter housing here. So that goes on just like that. You want to put the housing bolts go on there, and then you torque them on, and that's the next step. The thing about putting Vaseline on here, if you look at this, holds the gasket down real good, keeps it in place. So we got our gears in, we got it packed in with Vaseline, you got your cover. Now there's multiple bolts on this cover, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One of the bolts is actually inside the oil filter housing right there, and then the other bolts. Now I'm actually missing a bolt for this. I'm not sure what happened to it, so I'm going to put it on like this, and then I'm going to have to go to the hardware store obviously and get a bolt, unless I can find one around here. There's nothing really special about these bolts other than the fact that they have, you know, a smaller head on them than a normal bolt. It's so they're just a 1/4 bolt that goes on here. So what we want to do is we want to carefully locate this on our cover, and if you look, this square piece here goes right there. So we're just going to take and gently lower our cover down on here and get our bolts started without messing up our gasket. Now you don't want to use any kind of gasket sealer on this gasket, trust me. It's common practice not to do that. anytime we're dealing with the lubrication system, any kind of silicone gasket sealer or lube or anything of that nature, you don't want to risk it getting into the lubrication system because it can actually take the motor out if you're not careful. So we don't want to do anything like that. But we just want to get these bolts started, get them in. And once we get these started, we'll snug. Now you're going to run those down and torque them to specs, and then your housing is on, and then we can move on to the balancer.